Shōgun! The award-winning 2024 drama is based on this 1975 James Clavell classic. Is it worth the read? Well, today, young Hatomoto, I will be answering just that, because my name is The Advocate, and I am an advocate for Shōgun, a book review. Like, comment, and subscribe to help me slice through the evil YouTube algorithm. So, full disclosure, I have actually not watched the Shogun TV show yet, so this video will be primarily focused on my thoughts with regards to the original Shogun novel. However, if you'd like to see a review from me of that first season of the TV show, then definitely let me know by chiming down in the comments section below. Now, one of my biggest concerns prior to picking up this book was that, given that Shogun was released in 1975, and also given the more casual tolerance for racism back in the 70s, I was worried that Shōgun was going to fall into the same traps that other similar novels from that era fell into. You know the ones, novels where they treat a foreign culture like a punchline because of how crazy and kooky it is compared to the Western norm. But to my surprise, while there are some inaccuracies with regards to James Clavell's portrayal of 17th century Japan, such as mixing up some naming conventions or leaning a little too heavily on this over-the-top samurai obsession with seppuku, Shōgun is actually pretty respectful of Japanese culture. I mean, obviously I'm a non-Japanese reader, so I can only speak from my own understanding, but Clavell seems to capture feudal Japan in a way that feels thoughtful as opposed to caricatured. And I find that to be very impressive, especially given the fact that this book was published in 1975, a time when accuracy and cultural tact weren't exactly top priorities in most Western depictions of Asia. But okay. You might be asking yourself, alright Advocate, yes, I get it, Clavell is considerate of Japanese culture and the time period, and that's great and all. But should I read Shōgun? Well, my answer to that would be yes. But as to whether or not you'll enjoy your read-through, much like life, that really depends on what you personally enjoy. Do you already have a pre-existing interest in Japanese history or culture? Are you okay with that history being retold in a way that isn't the most accurate? Do you enjoy long books, especially ones that go over 1,000 pages? Within these long books, do you like reading about politics and scheming as opposed to action? Are you comfortable with narratives that are more about the journey than the destination? Well, if you answered yes to most of these, then chances are you'll enjoy this book. However, out of all these qualifiers, the one that probably jumps out to most readers before they even crack open this book's spine is its length. Because Shōgun is a long book. A very, very long book. At 420,000 plus words, Shōgun has a lot to say, but much of what it has to say essentially boils down to either listening in on the private conversations amongst the various samurai families of the story, following the current progress of the Portuguese Jesuit missions in Japan, or keeping up with the endless politicking and manipulation between the country's top power players. If none of that personally interests you, then chances are you're not going to have very much fun with these 1,300 pages. Additionally, for a book that is a lot about samurai wielding swords, there's not a lot of samurai using swords here. I mean, there are a few skirmishes here and there throughout the story, and Clavell does give us executions and seppuku aplenty in this exaggerated version of feudal Japan. But if you're reading Shōgun in hopes of seeing climactic all-out battles between these huge rival factions, you won't find that here. Shōgun is far more about the psychological political mind games than it is about swords clashing and grand militaristic set pieces. But man, those mind games sure are interesting. For me anyway, one of the more compelling parts of this story was seeing a character say one thing while privately thinking the exact opposite. That intentional dissonance between what is spoken and what is truly felt gives the story an edge that I found to be incredibly engaging. In Japan, there's this concept of hone and tatemae. Hone being your true feelings and tatemae being the facade you present in public. And while this idea isn't unique to Japan, as everyone around the world hides or softens their true feelings to some extent from the public, Clavell really leans into that philosophy in this book here. The result is a series of moments that are often funny yet revealing at the same time. Without spoiling specifics, a lot of the story's drama plays out like this. One character will say, "Omi, I need you to go from point A to point B. While secretly they're thinking, perfect, this will set up an encounter between Omi and this other character who I wish to manipulate from afar. Meanwhile, Omi, smiling politely and agreeing to the command, will be thinking to himself, you fool, I know what you're trying to do, I know what you're thinking, but instead, I'll twist your intended manipulation into my intended manipulation to my own family's advantage. And on it goes with everyone playing 4D chess in their heads, while outwardly, they're doing nothing more than just trading pleasantries and ordinary commands. It's brilliant and really cool to see unfold. All this to say, if you're willing to settle into what this book is actually trying to do, there's a lot of cool, subtle details here that a reader can immerse themselves into. And the immersion doesn't just end with the subtlety of the characters' actions and spoken dialogue, but also within the world that Clavell has built here within this book, because Shogun, in my opinion, has an incredibly immersive setting. Now, Clavell isn't exactly a poet here, but his writing is evocative enough to bring these Japanese towns and landscapes of this time period to life. He never leans into flowery prose, but his straightforward use of concrete nouns such as rock, garden, tile, sand, provide just enough sensory anchoring to make feudal Japan feel vivid in a reader's mind. The village was set around the crescent harbor that faced east, perhaps 200 houses unlike any he'd ever seen, nestling at the beginning of the mountain which spilled down to the shore. Above were terraced fields and dirt roads that led north and south. Below, the waterfront was cobbled and a stone launching ramp went from the shore into the sea. Now, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect this simplicity was intentional. Remember, this book was released back in 1975, long before Western readers had instant access to YouTube 4K walking tours of Osaka, Japan. So overloading a readership audience not accustomed to Japanese iconography with these hyper-detailed descriptions of said iconography might have been a little too disorienting for them. By keeping the prose simple, Clavell makes the setting familiar enough for Western readers to latch onto, whilst still transporting them into a different world. And it's a beautiful world to be sure. I mean, it could be my very own bias speaking here, as I've always been fascinated by anything having to do with Japan, but anytime Clavell describes something like a rock standing sentinel in the middle of a garden, or a lazy river winding underneath an arched bridge, I'm in love. Now, while the landscapes and nature within this story are immersive, something that does take a bit of getting used to is the way in which the story is told, primarily through the narrative device of having consistently shifting POV perspectives. Unlike the A Song of Ice and Fire series, where each chapter sticks to just one POV perspective before switching to another in the next chapter, Shogun often blends multiple POVs together within a single chapter, sometimes even within a single paragraph. One moment you'll be inside the head of John Blackthorne, the book's main character, and then suddenly, without warning, you'll be flipped into Omi's samurai perspective, and it's up to you as the reader to piece together whose head you're in based on the written context clues. Now, this can get a tad confusing if you're just skimming the story, but if you're paying enough attention, I think you should be just fine. Layered on top of that is the language issue. Now, the text for the most part is written in English, but the characters themselves are actually speaking either Japanese, Portuguese, Dutch, or Latin. And it's your job as the reader to decode which language is being spoken based on the POV perspective you're in. This can get a little tiring at times, but again, Clavell provides enough context to keep you oriented without you losing your footing in the constant language shifts. Going back to the list of qualifiers, another big one is the ending. Don't worry, I'll save the specifics for the spoiler section, but I think it's fair to say that Shogun doesn't wrap up this story in a way that some readers might expect. Tying this back to the book's limited action, if you're hoping for a neat, high-stakes finale where every plot thread gets tied up in a big explosive battle, you're probably going to walk away disappointed. The ending here is more subtle and semi-ambiguous. Now, personally for me, I appreciated the ending as the journey itself felt worthy of the investment. But I can totally understand how some readers might look back on the 1,300 pages they just read and potentially feel a little bit cheated, as if the payoff they got didn't really match the build-up. But before we delve into the specifics of why that is, I think now's as good a time as any to delve into spoilers! If you have yet to finish reading Shogun, click on the timestamps below to skip ahead to my final spoiler-free thoughts on this book. Otherwise, stick around and let's get spoilery. So yeah, the big brooding war that was simmering between Toranaga and Ishido's forces throughout the entire book never really happens on page. Or at least not in the way most readers might expect. Now, if you're a student of Japanese history, you should already know how this story ends. Yoshi Toranaga, based on real-life Tokugawa Ieyasu, ultimately defeats Ishido, a stand-in for Ishida Mitsunari, at the Battle of Sekigahara, thanks in large part to key commanders defecting over to Toranaga/Tokugawa's side. That victory ultimately paves the way for Toranaga to become shogun and expel the Portuguese from his country in an effort to curb Christianity's influence in Japan. But even if you're not a history buff, that outcome still feels like a foregone conclusion, because by the time you reach Toranaga's final monologue in the book, it's clear that every goal he sets out for himself always unfolds exactly as he has planned, meaning that when he lays out how and why he'll win the war, that's pretty much how and why the war will play out. So even though we never see the war itself, it personally doesn't really feel like much of a loss to me because the result is inevitable. And if Clavell had elected to walk us through every clash and skirmish that was to take place, it probably would have read a lot like padding because we already know the result. Which is kind of why I have such a love-hate relationship with the character of Toranaga. On the one hand, he is an absolutely fascinating strategist and is easily the most compelling power figure in the novel. Every move he makes is deliberate, and watching him pull the strings and manipulate everyone around him, Blackthorn and Mariko included, is genuinely impressive. On the other hand, watching him pull the strings and manipulate everyone around him, Blackthorn and Mariko included, also wears thin after a while. Because Toranaga never fails. Ever. Even when it looks like he's on the verge of stumbling, it's merely a misdirect because it turns out that Toranaga has already accounted for this exact contingency and he knew he was going to fail here, so he planned for what to do at this exact situation. And after reading through 1,300 pages of Toranaga successfully orchestrating every single outcome to his exact specification, it all does start to feel a bit repetitive after a while. I mean, I get it. Toranaga has that light Yagami aura. He's always in control and always 30 steps ahead. But unlike Light, Toranaga never has a downfall. He just keeps winning and winning. And while the final reveal of him dropping the facade and admitting to the reader that yes, Toranaga did in fact always want to be a shogun despite him publicly saying otherwise all those times throughout the book, and the book's title Shogun is named after him, is a clever twist, it doesn't really overcome the fatigue of watching him succeed at everything he does without exception. So what do you know? I've got gripes with the power-hungry, manipulative prick at the center of this story. What a bold and nuanced moral stance to take, advocate. However, while I definitely have issues with the tiresomely infallible Toranaga, two characters I don't have a single complaint about are his two favorite pawns. I mean, Trusted Castle and Queen chess pieces. Toranaga's goshawk, Blackthorn Anjin-san, and his peregrine, Toda Mariko. Starting with Blackthorn, although it was obvious from the start of the story that Blackthorn was going to have a character transformation from a brash, arrogant Englishman completely out of his depth in Japan, to someone who gradually grows to love the country and adopt its customs, the journey itself was still quite compelling. Watching Blackthorn stumble through the language, pick up Japanese etiquette piece by piece, and even learn how to play a little bit of hone in his pursuit of his ultimate prize, the Black Ship, makes for a satisfying arc, even if at the end of the day he never really actually gets the Black Ship. Mariko is fascinating as well, but for different reasons. Despite being trapped in what is essentially a Stockholm Syndrome-like relationship with her abusive husband Buntaro, Toda Mariko still finds moments of agency within this rigid feudal system to act on her own. Even when Toranaga gives her the chance to divorce Buntaro, Mariko asserts her own will by asking him not to make the divorce public until after the Osaka negotiations. Mariko then later leverages her position with the Catholic daimyo Kiyama, the man who despises Blackthorn's ship, the Erasmus, for threatening Portuguese trade, by promising him the ship's destruction if it will save Blackthorn's life. Of course, Toranaga has already foreseen this and folded it neatly into his grand design, but Mariko still acts on her own behalf and even manages to spit in the face of the deceased Taiko who had her father executed within the plans Toranaga had set. Blackthorn and Mariko are brilliant, layered, and deeply human, which is exactly why their romance, in my opinion, works. Now, romance is not something I usually go hunting for in my books, and this is all subjective, but I thought the burgeoning relationship between Mariko and Blackthorn was pretty well handled. They spend 1,000 pages in each other's company, and because of the language barrier, Mariko is often the only person Blackthorn can openly confide in. So when you combine all that page time of constant proximity and shared vulnerability, it feels inevitable that these two would eventually catch feelings for each other. It's all paced pretty well and feels earned. The only thing I'll say about their romance that didn't quite land for me was its ending. Now, don't get me wrong, I was saddened when Mariko left the story, and her farewell letter to Blackthorn is still an emotional gut punch, but the actual moment of her death at Osaka Castle didn't quite have the impact I expected. And that mostly comes down to the fact that we had just previously experienced her fake-out death just a few chapters earlier when she threatened seppuku. That scene felt like an emotional closure and a natural point to end her story on. So when she survives that moment, only to later die in a door explosion, it did feel kind of weaker by comparison. But still, the weight of her loss did eventually catch up to me. And when Blackthorn reads Mariko's final letter, where she admits that she had long ago accepted that Osaka was where she was going to die, but she was at peace with that because it meant saving Blackthorn's life, that's when it finally landed for me. And in that moment, I, alongside Blackthorn, was finally able to properly grieve for the loss of this character. Thou, I love thee. If this is read by thee, then I am dead in Osaka, and perhaps, because of me, thy ship is dead too. I may sacrifice this most prized part of thy life because of my faith, to safeguard my church, but more, to save thy life, which is more precious to me than everything, even the interest of my lord Toranaga. It may come to a choice, my love, thee or thy ship. So sorry, but I choose life for thee. The ship is doomed anyway, with or without thee. I will concede thy ship to thine enemy so that thou may live. This ship is nothing. Build another. This thou canst do. Were you not taught to be a builder of ships as well as a navigator of ships? I believe Lord Toranaga will give thee all the craftsmen, carpenters, and metal craftsmen necessary. He needs you and your ships. And from my personal estate, I have bequeathed thee all the money necessary. Build another ship, and build another life, my love. Take next year's black ship, and live forever. Listen, my dear one, my Christian soul prays to see thee again in a Christian heaven. My Japanese hara prays that in the next life, I will be whatever is necessary to bring thee joy, and to be with thee wherever thou art. Forgive me, but thy life is all important. I love thee. And that's why their relationship works for me. It's two flawed, very vulnerable people building an emotional connection with each other throughout this story. Something Toranaga considers to be a weakness and something the society of this story doesn't really prioritize. It's love versus duty, and I love it. There are other elements about this story that I really liked, such as the crash course history of Portuguese missions in Japan, lessons on Japanese language and culture, and a surprisingly nuanced exploration of Christianity and religion as a whole. This book could have easily fallen into the trap of being a one-dimensional good guy locals versus evil foreign invaders, or noble missionaries versus savage locals. But Shōgun instead aims for something more human. It reminds us that no matter if someone is Japanese, Portuguese, or Dutch, Christian, Buddhist, or atheist, male or female, good and bad people exist everywhere. Good and bad exists in everyone. That nuanced thematic balance makes Shōgun feel like a complete read, even despite a quote-unquote lack of a proper ending. So all in all, despite its staggering 1,300-page length, Shōgun blends an immersive setting, engaging political intrigue, and an emotional core that makes this journey worthwhile. Yes, I had some issues with one particular character, and the ending won't be for everyone, but thematically this novel does more than enough, in my opinion, to earn its place as a really good book, especially if you're someone who's already fascinated by Japanese history or culture. But what say you? Did you personally enjoy Shōgun? Do you agree or disagree with any of my points? Definitely let me know by chiming down in the comment section below. I'd also be keen to hear your guys' thoughts on the 2024 Shogun TV show adaptation if you guys have seen it as well. Is it a good adaptation? If it interests you, I may watch the show and kind of do a book versus show comparison if that's something you guys would like to see, but definitely let me know. However, until then, thank you so very much for watching this video, guys. I truly do appreciate every single one of you. Until next time, the Advocate, out.